Poe, and of course the supporting cast, the nurses are also very, very important to our film as well. So you meet the main characters.
There were moments on set when the director stepped back and allowed the women involved to take the lead in shaping certain scenes, choosing to engage more as an actor than as a director. He didn't want those scenes to feel as though they were being controlled or framed through a male perspective. So he consciously removed himself from that dynamic when appropriate. Switching gears to the legal developments surrounding Wayfair and its related entities, another lawsuit has been filed, this time against the Wayfair Foundation, which shut down nearly a year ago. The closure of the foundation coincided with significant events involving Steve Sarowitz, and now a former employee, Celeste Smith, has brought a federal lawsuit against him. Although Justin Baldoni's name has been loosely connected to the broader network of companies, he had no direct involvement with the Wayfair Foundation, did not work there, and played no role in the circumstances described in the lawsuit. The foundation itself was based in Chicago, and that is where the alleged conflict occurred. The timing of this case raises questions because the events at issue took place almost a year ago, and the foundation's closure preceded Smith's termination. In her complaint, Smith explains that she had worked at the non-profit branch of Wayfair Pathways for several years and had even been promoted multiple times. She claims she was aggressively recruited and promised that the foundation would exist for at least 15 more years, implying long-term job security. However, in the United States, employment is generally at will unless governed by a specific contract, meaning employers can terminate employment at any time. Promises about the longevity of an organization can also be difficult to enforce, as nonprofits can close for a variety of reasons. Smith brings her claims under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Title VII applies to employers with 15 or more employees. One complication is that the Wayfair Foundation reportedly had fewer than 15 employees. To address that issue, Smith attempts to connect the foundation to Wayfair Pathways, the for-profit parent entity, arguing they operated under a unified umbrella. Whether the court accepts that theory remains to be seen, as she was technically employed by the foundation rather than the larger company. In her complaint, Smith identifies herself as a 52-year-old African-American woman who is Muslim and a member of the Nation of Islam. She alleges anti-Muslim discrimination and xenophobia, describing what she characterizes as hostility from leadership, including questions about her faith and her involvement with the Nation of Islam. She recounts attending a breakfast at Steve Sarowitz's home where she says she was asked specific questions about the Quran and her religious affiliation. The religious component of the case adds further complexity. Title VII protects employees from discrimination based on religion, but it does not extend protection to political ideologies or social doctrines that fall outside core religious practice. The Nation of Islam is distinct from mainstream Islam and promotes a set of social and political teachings, including black separatism and other community-focused doctrines. Smith frames her allegations as anti-Muslim discrimination, but the legal analysis may turn on whether the alleged conflict involved protected religious practice or broader ideological disagreements. She also references tensions connected to discussions about Israel and Palestine, adding another layer to the dispute. Overall, this case presents a mix of employment law questions, religious discrimination claims, and organizational structure issues. The foundation's size, its relationship to the parent company, the nature of any promises made regarding long-term employment, and the distinction between religious protection and ideological conflict will likely be central to how the court evaluates the claims. The Nation of Islam is a separate, religious movement founded in the 1930s in the United States. For decades it has been led by Louis Farrakhan, who, by 2024, is in his 90s and largely out of the public eye. The organization has a long and controversial history, including teachings rooted in black separatism and rhetoric that has at times portrayed white people as inherently oppressive or evil. Malcolm X was famously a minister within the Nation of Islam during the 1950s and early 1960s before later breaking away from the group. One of the disputes described in the lawsuit centers on a proposed $50,000 grant to a Muslim clinic in Chicago. According to the complaint, Steve Sarowitz questioned whether the clinic had ties to Malcolm X's widow, Betty Shabazz, who is now deceased. The issue, as framed in the lawsuit, is presented as anti-Muslim bias. However, an alternative interpretation could be that the questioning related less to Islam as a religion and more to concerns about ideological alignment. If a foundation's stated mission emphasizes unity and social oneness, leadership might reasonably scrutinize whether a potential grantee promotes separatist principles or racially charged doctrines that conflict with that mission. As the primary funder of the foundation, Sarowitz would have discretion to evaluate whether organizations seeking grants align with the foundation's values. That kind of vetting, at least on its face, concerns ideology and mission fit rather than religion alone. The Nation of Islam's history includes positions that many consider extreme, such as opposition to interracial marriage and At times, rhetoric widely criticized as a donor deciding not to associate his foundation with such controversies does not automatically equate to discrimination against Muslims generally, particularly given that the Nation of Islam is distinct from mainstream Sunni or Shia Islam. The religious dimension becomes even more nuanced considering that the foundation is described as Baha-inspired. The Baha faith emphasizes unity of humanity and draws in part from Islamic texts, including the Quran, though it is a distinct faith tradition. Mainstream Muslim communities themselves often do not recognize the Nation of Islam as part of Orthodox Islam, viewing it instead as a separate movement with unique doctrines. That distinction could matter legally, because Title VII protects individuals from discrimination based on religion, but it does not protect every political or social ideology that may accompany a religious affiliation. The complaint also references tensions related to discussions about Israel and Palestine, describing an incident in fall 2024 in which Saruwitz allegedly expressed strong concerns about pro-Palestinian activism at an event. He reportedly later apologized, and at one point was even told he could not come into the foundation's office despite being its primary financial backer, after leadership changes, including the CEO taking a leave of absence and eventually departing. An interim replacement was needed. At that stage, Saruwitz appointed Jennifer Wiggle to an interim leadership role. The plaintiff alleges age discrimination, claiming Wiggle was 8 years younger, that she was denied the opportunity to apply because there was no formal hiring process. However, Wiggle is reportedly 2 years older than the plaintiff, not younger. She is a 3-time Emmy Award-winning journalist in Chicago with extensive public-facing communications experience, non-profit involvement, and a long-standing relationship with the foundation. In an emergency or transitional context, there is generally no legal requirement that an organization publicly post or conduct interviews for an interim executive role. Ultimately, the case weaves together allegations of religious discrimination, ideological conflict, age discrimination, and procedural unfairness. Whether the dispute centers on protected religious identity or on disagreements over political ideology and organizational mission will likely be a key issue for the court to determine. The complaint also expands into disability and age discrimination claims. After suffering a rib injury at home, she sought protections under the ADA and was placed on a restricted schedule of 4 hours per day, working remotely. During that same period, she continued filing internal complaints against both Steve Saruwitz and Jennifer Wiggle, asserting retaliation and hostile treatment. Much of her frustration appears tied to Wiggle's interim leadership appointment, which she believed she deserved. She characterizes Wiggle as significantly younger, though publicly available information indicates Wiggle is actually older. While on medical leave, tensions escalated further. She alleges that Wiggle made unreasonable demands and that responses to her complaints were retaliatory. At the same time, she continued filing grievances against the foundation and its leadership. Then, in late April, a serious external event occurred. An individual allegedly attempted to set fire to Saruwitz's home and issued violent threats against him and his family. These threats were reportedly graphic and deeply disturbing. Within days before any arrest had been made, Saruwitz shut down the Wayfair Foundation, citing safety concerns for himself, his family, and staff. The plaintiff argues the closure was she claims the foundation's functions were effectively moved under Wayfair pathways and that the shutdown was designed to avoid investigating HR complaints. She also alleges further age discrimination when a new leadership role within the restructured organization was filled by someone she describes as younger, white, and aligned with the BAR faith, whom she believed she was entitled to replace. Additionally, she raises concerns about being pressured to hire Saruwitz's nephew, suggesting improper favoritism. However, nepotism alone is not illegal under federal law, and founders generally retain broad discretion in hiring decisions unless those decisions violate protected class statutes. If the defendants move to dismiss, they will likely argue that several claims are legally insufficient as pleaded, particularly the age discrimination assertions if the comparative ages are misstated. More broadly, they may contend that the dispute centers not on religion but on ideological incompatibility and workplace dynamics. This distinction could become central. The Nation of Islam promotes a set of doctrines that include black separatism and racial self-determination, while Title VII protects employees from discrimination based on religion and sincerely held religious practices. It does not protect all political or ideological advocacy that may be associated with a religious identity, especially if such advocacy disrupts workplace operations or conflicts with an organization's core mission. By contrast, Saruwitz's foundation publicly emphasized inclusion, unity across races and faiths, and collaborative humanitarian work. If leadership believed that certain expressed views or advocacy undermined that mission, whether intentionally or unintentionally, they may frame their actions as performance and culture-based decisions rather than religious bias. An employer cannot discriminate because someone is Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Baha, or affiliated with any faith. But an employer can take action if an employee's conduct religious or otherwise materially interferes with operations, team cohesion, or organizational objectives. Ultimately, the court would need to determine whether the alleged adverse actions were motivated by protected religious identity, protected age status, or disability, or whether they were driven by concerns about workplace performance, leadership structure, safety, and mission alignment. That legal distinction will likely define how viable her claims are moving forward. Because she served in a senior executive role, her influence would naturally extend to hiring decisions, internal culture, donor relationships, and the public image of the organization. When someone in that position promotes a worldview that others perceive as politically or ideologically charged, leadership may evaluate whether that direction aligns with the foundation's stated mission. If significant tension developed around her influence, particularly regarding who was hired, what initiatives were prioritized, or how the organization positioned itself publicly, that can raise questions of mission alignment rather than automatically constituting religious discrimination. A key legal distinction here is the difference between protected religion and broader ideology. Membership in the Nation of Islam is religiously affiliated, but courts generally protect sincerely held religious beliefs and practices, not every political or social doctrine associated with a group. If the conflict centered on separatist ideology or leadership philosophy rather than bias against Islam as a faith, that becomes a much more difficult discrimination claim to prove. Another challenge is the level of detail, referencing unnamed colleagues who were impacted without identifying them. Describing their complaints or explaining how they were harmed may weaken the persuasiveness of the allegations. Courts typically look for specific facts showing discriminatory intent or disparate treatment, not just generalized assertions. She also acknowledges being offered a separation agreement that included 2 months of pay through a specified end date. If she signed a release of claims as part of that agreement, it could significantly limit her ability to bring later litigation. If she declined to sign, then the offer itself is not necessarily evidence of discrimination. Likewise, employers undergoing restructuring are not legally obligated to transfer every employee into a successor entity. If leadership determined she was not the right fit for the restructured organization due to philosophy, management style, or perceived incompatibility with the mission, that decision, absent unlawful bias, can fall within employer discretion. Timing may also be an obstacle. Under federal law, discrimination claims generally must be filed with the EEOC within 300 days of the alleged unlawful act in jurisdictions with a state agency. If the events she references began in late 2024 and she did not timely file an administrative charge, some of those claims could be time-barred unless an exception applies. Filing suit well after the fact can complicate procedural viability. There is also the broader context of the foundation's closure. According to public reporting, Steve Sarowitz shut down the organization following serious threats against him and his family. If the closure can be credibly tied to security concerns rather than internal HR disputes, that undercuts the argument that it was pretext to remove her specifically. Speculation about outside influence, whether from public figures or ongoing litigation involving Wayfair, would likely carry little weight legally unless supported by concrete evidence. Courts focus on facts. Was she treated differently because of her protected characteristics? Were similarly situated individuals treated more favorably? Were actions taken for legitimate, documented business reasons? Ultimately, the case appears to hinge on 3 major questions. Were adverse actions motivated by religion, age, or disability? Or were they driven by restructuring, leadership disagreement, ideological conflict, and safety concerns? And were the claims filed within the legally required time? Those procedural and substantive distinctions, not speculation about motive, will likely determine whether the lawsuit can move forward successfully. Understandable to feel frustrated when multiple lawsuits surface around the same group of people or organizations. From the outside, it can look repetitive or strategic, but it's also important to separate speculation from what the legal system actually requires. Attorneys do have professional and ethical obligations to ensure that the claims they file have a factual and legal basis. If a complaint includes an age discrimination comparison, for example, verifying the comparator's age would be a basic step. That said, initial pleadings sometimes contain factual disputes, and those issues are typically sorted out through motions to dismiss, discovery, or summary judgment. Courts, not public opinion, ultimately determine whether claims are supported. It's also common in employment disputes for situations rooted in workplace conflict, restructuring, or leadership disagreements to be framed as discrimination if the employee believes protected characteristics played a role. Sometimes that belief is validated by evidence. Other times it isn't. The legal question isn't whether someone felt overlooked or mistreated, it's whether the employer took adverse action because of a legally protected characteristic like religion, age, or disability. If leadership believed there was a genuine ideological or mission misalignment, that can be a lawful basis for separation, provided it isn't a pretext for discrimination. Employers generally have discretion to choose executives who align with their organizational philosophy, especially in mission-driven nonprofits. The key issue is motive. Was the action taken because of protected status, or because of performance, culture fit, restructuring, or safety concerns? As for timing or connections to other public controversies involving figures like Blake Lively, it's natural to notice patterns, but without direct evidence, it remains speculation. Courts focus on documented facts, timelines, filings with agencies like the EEOC, and whether procedural requirements were met. Questions about strategy or media impact may be interesting, but they don't decide cases. Ultimately, lawsuits stop when either parties choose not to file them, claims are dismissed, settlements are reached, or courts resolve them. The legal system is designed to test the strength of claims through motions and evidence, not through headlines. If you're analyzing this from a commentary perspective, one constructive approach is to focus on the legal standards, burden of proof, protected classes, timing requirements, and employer defenses. Those frameworks tend to clarify whether a case is likely to move forward or struggle proceed. It will be up to the court to determine whether this is discrimination, retaliation, or simply a contentious employment breakup framed through a legal lens.